The year was 1954, and downtown theaters across America were packed for a brand new crime thriller. Outside, the marquee lights bathed the sidewalk in gold. Inside, the smell of popcorn hung in the air as a packed house waited for the main feature. But first, the trailers. A booming voice promised the most daring adventure yet, and black and white images flickered across the screen. It looked like any other preview, until someone noticed something strange. A single frame flashed so quickly that it was almost invisible. It wasn't part of the movie. It wasn't part of the trailer. And to a handful of very specific people in that audience, it meant something. Whispers started in the projection booths and spread through backroom bars. That flicker wasn't an accident. It was a signal. And not just to anyone, but to the men who ran the gambling halls, the smuggling routes, and the kind of deals that never saw the light of day. At a time when the mob's hand was in everything from boxing matches to Broadway ticket sales, Hollywood was the perfect megaphone. The strange thing was, these alleged messages didn't feel like random accidents. Sometimes it was a phone number scrawled on a wall in the background. Other times, a newspaper headline visible for just a heartbeat. And always in trailers for films that just happened to be playing in certain neighborhoods with certain friendly theater owners, the kind who didn't ask questions. It sounded like something out of a spy movie, but the rumors refused to die. Projectionists swore they'd spliced reels that contained scenes not in the studio master prints. Studio employees claimed they were told to leave that shot in, no questions. And the question that hung in the air like cigarette smoke was simple. If the mob was really slipping coded messages into movie trailers, how many millions of people had unknowingly seen them? Because in the glamorous, neon-lit world of 1950s, Hollywood, the brightest lights often cast the darkest shadows. And sometimes, the biggest secrets were hiding right there on the silver screen. The 1950s were Hollywood's golden glow years. Or at least, that's what the magazines wanted you to believe. On the surface, it was all premieres at Grauman's Chinese Theater, starlets posing beside Cadillac convertibles, and leading men with perfect smiles lighting cigarettes for gossip columnists. But beneath the glitter was a strange tension. The Cold War was in full swing, and America was split between the fear of communist infiltration and the thrill of post-war prosperity. Every newsstand was stocked with movie magazines promising behind-the-scenes exclusives, but the real behind-the-scenes stories were far murkier. FBI agents kept tabs on suspected radicals in the film industry, and studio bosses quietly blacklisted actors, writers, and directors without ever admitting it to the press. Paranoia ran deep, and that paranoia created the perfect breeding ground for conspiracy. It wasn't just about politics. Money was everywhere, and where there was money, the mob wasn't far behind. Organized crime had already cemented its grip on Las Vegas casinos and East Coast nightclubs, but Los Angeles was the real jewel. The studios were massive money-making machines, and the theaters were the direct pipeline to the public. If you could get a message into a movie trailer, you weren't just talking to one person, you were speaking to thousands in a single night. Hollywood had its own unwritten rule. As long as the audience kept buying tickets, no one asked too many questions about what happened between the studio lot and the projector booth. And in a decade when technology was still film-based, messages could be slipped in with a razor blade and some tape. Nothing digital, nothing traceable. The glamour distracted from the grit. Flashbulbs blinded you from seeing who was really sitting in the back row. And somewhere between the champagne premieres and the cigarette smoke in projection rooms, a dangerous question lingered. If the mob wanted to use Hollywood as its messenger, who exactly was going to stop them? If the silver screen was Hollywood's stage, then the projection booth was its hidden control room. In the 1950s, movie trailers weren't distributed digitally or beamed in by satellite. They arrived on bulky reels of physical film, hand-delivered in metal canisters. Every theater in America had a projectionist, usually a solitary figure perched in a small, sweltering room high above the audience, threading the film through heavy machinery that hummed and clicked like a mechanical heartbeat. And here's the thing. Projectionists had a strange kind of power. They could splice, edit, or even replace parts of a reel before it ever hit the screen. With a steady hand and the right tools, a single frame, just 1/24th of a second, could be inserted into a trailer, visible only as a fleeting flash to the human eye, but enough to register subconsciously. Advertisers knew about this subliminal trick. So did the mob. Rumors began swirling that certain projectionists, especially those working in mob-connected theaters, were paid to make special edits to the reels. These edits weren't about changing the plot of a trailer. They were about slipping in coded visuals, signals, or even cryptic written phrases. A symbol could mean, "A deal is good to go." A certain face might warn, "Stay away from the next meeting." For the average moviegoer, it was just a blur between cuts. For those in the know, it was a direct line of communication. Because film reels often changed hands multiple times before reaching theaters, tracking where a message originated was nearly impossible. Was it spliced in at the studio, the distribution hub, or right there in the projection booth minutes before the first showing? In smoky mob hangouts across Los Angeles, whispers claimed that even police detectives couldn't prove anything because the edits could be undone just as quickly as they were made. A few snips, a few splices, and the incriminating frame vanished like it was never there. And the most unsettling part? Sometimes these messages weren't meant for criminals at all. Some were aimed directly at the stars of Hollywood themselves. A subtle reminder that no matter how famous they were, someone was always watching. For decades, the idea of hidden messages in movie trailers was dismissed as the stuff of pulp novels and paranoid gossip. But every so often, a story would leak, usually from someone who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. In smoky Hollywood bars and dimly lit after-parties, actors whispered about strange flashes during trailers that felt wrong. One such whisper came from a rising starlet in the mid-1950s. She swore that during a sneak preview for her latest film, she saw a single frame of an unfamiliar man's face, just for an instant, between two action shots. The man was glaring directly into the camera, and the image vanished before she could even blink. Later, when she described it to her agent, his face went pale, and he urged her to forget it if she wanted to keep working. Another tale came from a popular leading man of the era, known for his square jaw and squeaky clean reputation. In an unguarded moment after a few drinks, he told friends that while sitting in a theater, he noticed his own name flash in the middle of a trailer for a completely unrelated movie. Not in the credits, just his name, stark and bold, gone in a fraction of a second. It was followed by a symbol he didn't recognize. Weeks later, rumors swirled that he had backed out of a high-profile deal with a studio that had mob ties. The strangest accounts came from those who saw these flashes repeatedly, almost like they were being targeted. One actress claimed she saw a brief image of her Beverly Hills home in a trailer for a gangster film. Another insisted she spotted a message written in blocky white letters. "You know what you owe." Of course, these stories were easy to dismiss. After all, without the physical film reel to prove it, it was just hearsay. And the mob counted on that. They knew fear was more powerful than proof. If a star believed the message was for them, that belief alone could be enough to control them. By the late 1950s, the whispers among Hollywood's elite had become a low hum of paranoia. Some stars refused to attend premieres altogether, sending assistants or stand-ins instead. Others started bringing private detectives to screenings, though no one ever admitted publicly what they were looking for. Because in Hollywood's golden age, it wasn't the cameras you had to watch out for. It was the flashes you didn't see coming. The golden age of Hollywood loved to pretend it was built on glitz, talent, and a little bit of luck. But in reality, the studios had their own code of silence, and when it came to the mob's little experiments in movie trailers, the big bosses didn't just ignore them, They sometimes made them possible. The film industry in the 1950s was a tightly controlled machine. Every frame of every movie, every reel of promotional material passed through the hands of studio technicians and executives before it ever reached a theater. So, if the mob was slipping hidden frames into trailers, they weren't doing it without inside help. Projectionists in major cities began to notice something odd. Some reels came sealed in envelopes stamped with the name of a major studio. But the return address belonged to a company no one had heard of. Inside, the trailers looked normal, except for the occasional unmarked splice, no studio tag, no paperwork explaining why it was there. These frames would be impossible to spot without slowing the reel down frame by frame. In real-time projection, they were invisible to the naked eye, except for the strange, lingering feeling they left behind. Why would studios allow this? Part of it was fear. The mob had a grip on certain union branches, especially the ones that handled film editing, distribution, and projection. Angering them meant risking strikes, lost shipments, or worse. And part of it, insiders whispered, was profit. A quiet deal here, a little hush money there, and everyone walked away richer, except the people whose careers or lives were quietly destroyed by those messages. Even when rumors reached the press, the studios moved quickly to smother the flames. Reporters were pressured, editors were bribed, and anyone who asked too many questions found themselves suddenly cut off from studio screenings. The public never caught on, and the studios made sure it stayed that way. By the end of the decade, this quiet cooperation had turned into a dangerous precedent. The mob didn't need to own the studios to control them. They just needed the right people in the right places to look the other way. By the mid-1950s, the whispers had grown too loud for the federal government to ignore. Anonymous tips, leaked memos, and even a few frightened projectionists made their way to the FBI with stories of tampered trailers. Agents began quietly investigating, combing through reels from theaters in Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. What they found was frustrating. Most trailers showed nothing unusual, but every so often a reel contained just a few frames, barely a blink, of an image that didn't belong. A warehouse, a playing card, a man's face, sometimes a string of numbers. Out of context, these fragments were meaningless, but in the coded language of organized crime, they could have been anything: a meeting location, a warning, a debt reminder. The FBI faced a bigger problem: chain of custody. Once a trailer left the studio, it passed through too many hands: union drivers, theater managers, projectionists, to prove where the tampering happened. Mob insiders were careful, never altering multiple reels in the same place or at the same time. And the ones who did the splicing? They were ghosts, often day laborers paid in cash, with no paper trail. Agents even tried seizing entire shipments of promotional reels, running them through slow-motion projectors in secret labs. They collected a few suspicious snippets, but nothing that could stand up in court. The mob could always argue it was a prank, a film lab error, or the work of a rogue editor with a sense of humor. Behind the scenes, some FBI officials suspected that higher-ups in the studio system were tipping off the mob. Raids were planned only for the mob to mysteriously move materials hours beforehand. Witnesses who had agreed to testify suddenly recanted or disappeared. By 1959, the Bureau had burned through its budget for the operation without a single conviction. In the official record, the case was quietly closed. But insiders claimed the mob simply got smarter, shifting from hidden film frames to other methods of passing messages through Hollywood's glittering machine. In 1960, Hollywood's gossip columns buzzed with the name Johnny Rizzo, a rising actor with the kind of face studios loved and the kind of voice that could melt a microphone. What few knew was that Rizzo had an insatiable curiosity about the darker corners of the industry. He wasn't content to just read his lines and collect his paycheck. He wanted to understand who really ran Hollywood. While filming on location in Las Vegas, Rizzo struck up a friendship with a projectionist who worked at one of the Strip's smaller theaters. Over whiskey and poker, the man let slip that some of the trailers he handled weren't quite what they seemed. At first, Rizzo thought it was just drunken rambling, but when the projectionist showed him a reel with a single frame of what looked like a numbered locker in a bus station, he couldn't shake it. Rizzo began asking quiet questions, first to crew members, then to low-level studio employees. The more he asked, the colder the room got. Friends stopped returning his calls. His agent warned him to stay in his lane if he wanted to keep working, but Rizzo couldn't let it go. He started carrying a small 8mm camera everywhere, secretly recording trailers he saw in theaters and running them through a projector at home, frame by frame. That's when he found it. A clear image of a man he recognized, not from Hollywood, but from headlines about a Chicago mob trial 2 years earlier. The man was smiling, holding a glass of champagne. The shot was buried 3 minutes into a coming attraction reel for a musical comedy. Rizzo told a close friend he was going to blow this thing open. But before he could, his apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, except his film canisters and camera. 2 days later, on his way to a late-night meeting, Rizzo's car skidded off Mulholland Drive and plunged into a ravine. The coroner called it an accident. The gossip columns called it a tragedy. Those who knew better called it a warning. In the weeks after Johnny Rizzo's so-called accident, the Hollywood machine shifted into overdrive, though not in the way it did for other young actors who met a tragic end. There were no memorial specials, no studio-issued tributes, no sudden rush to re-release his films. Instead, Rizzo's name seemed to vanish from the industry almost overnight. Crew members who had worked with him noticed that his scenes in upcoming projects were quietly reshot with other actors. Publicists were instructed to minimize references to him in interviews. And when curious journalists tried to dig deeper into his crash, they hit a wall of studio silence. Some reported getting phone calls from unknown men telling them to drop the story. Others simply found their press passes revoked, effectively ending their Hollywood careers. Meanwhile, inside the projection booths of major theaters, something strange was happening. The reels that Rizzo had been obsessed with, those containing odd, out-of-place images, were recalled by distributors under the pretense of print errors or technical faults. Projectionists were told to destroy them after replacement copies arrived. Those who hesitated were reportedly offered cash to stay quiet, or in some cases, threatened with losing their jobs. Rumors swirled that a major studio head had personally met with a pair of well-dressed consultants just days before the police officially closed Rizzo's case. No one knew exactly what was said behind those closed doors, but the timing was too perfect to ignore. Within a week, any trace of Rizzo's private investigation had been wiped clean. Film reels gone, notes missing. Even the projectionist who first tipped him off had abruptly left town. Yet there were whispers that one small fragment of film survived. A low-quality copy of one of the suspicious frames, grainy, distorted, but still clear enough to make out a man's face, circulated quietly among a handful of insiders. Some said it was kept as a bargaining chip. Others claimed it was insurance in case the mob ever turned on its Hollywood allies. For years, the strange death of Johnny Rizzo and the whispers about hidden messages in movie trailers stayed buried under layers of studio secrecy and mob intimidation. But in 1957, an unexpected break came. Not from Hollywood gossip columns, but from a routine FBI investigation into organized crime's financial networks. While combing through banking records tied to a suspected mob front, agents noticed a series of unusual payments, large, irregular sums funneled through a chain of shell companies. On paper, they were advertising expenses billed to various film studios. But when agents traced the paper trail, they found that the money didn't go to ad agencies or theater chains. Instead, it ended up in the accounts of a small, nondescript editing house in Los Angeles. Curious, the FBI pulled the editing house's work orders. That's when the pieces started to click. Many of the jobs were for cutting trailers. specifically for major studio releases between 1951 and 1955. But alongside the legitimate edits were requests for single-frame inserts, with vague descriptions like visual placeholder or atmosphere shot. These tiny visual blips were so fast they could slip past sensors and even most viewers, but they were perfect for sending coded signals. The agents compared the trailers to archived prints and found them. Brief flashes of images that had no connection to the films. A photo of a man's face, a street address scrawled on a sign, even what looked like a date stamped in bold type. Someone was using Hollywood's biggest marketing tool to pass information, and they were doing it in plain sight. One particular trailer stood out. It matched the same title Johnny Rizzo had been working on before his death. In the original cut, the FBI spotted a frame of a nondescript warehouse in Chicago, an image later tied to a mob-controlled shipping company. It was undeniable proof that Rizzo had been on to something real. But the most shocking part? The FBI soon discovered that some of these messages weren't just for mobsters. They were warnings. One insert appeared to be a death threat, aimed squarely at someone in the film industry. And it wouldn't take long before agents connected that threat to a string of mysterious accidents on set. When the FBI quietly confronted certain studio executives about the trailer inserts, they didn't get outrage or denial. They got silence. The kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they've been caught in a game they can't afford to lose. For decades, the public had believed the studio's main battles were with rival production companies or censors. But behind the velvet curtains and the glossy premieres, there was an unspoken truth. Some of Hollywood's most influential executives were entangled in backroom deals with organized crime. These relationships weren't just about money, they were about survival. The mob controlled theaters, labor unions, and even certain suppliers. Crossing them could mean stalled productions, sabotaged premieres, or worse. The hidden messages in trailers were part of a much bigger arrangement. In exchange for allowing these coded frames to slip through, studios received protection, meaning no union strikes, no threats to stars, and guaranteed distribution in mob-controlled territories. The FBI's findings suggested that a handful of high-ranking producers knew exactly what was going on, but they framed it as an unavoidable cost of doing business. One agent later described it as a hostage situation dressed up as a handshake deal. The mob didn't need to own the studios outright. They just needed leverage. And with millions of dollars riding on every film, a few seconds of footage in a trailer seemed like a small price to pay. But the more the FBI dug, the more it became clear that these insertions weren't harmless. In several cases, shortly after a trailer containing one of these coded messages was released, a rival mobster was found dead, a union leader vanished, or a deal swung heavily in the mob's favor. Hollywood had become a silent accomplice, its promotional reels doubling as a courier service for criminal instructions. And yet, the studios kept playing along, because the alternative was unthinkable. Those who resisted the mob's influence often found themselves on the wrong side of scandals, financial ruin, or sudden accidents that made headlines for all the wrong reasons. For years, whispers about mob-coded trailers floated through Hollywood's back alleys and studio commissaries. Most dismissed them as conspiracy talk, until one man stepped forward with proof. His name has been largely erased from industry history, but insiders remember him as a mid-level post-production editor who handled dozens of major film trailers in the late 1950s. According to surviving FBI files, this editor, let's call him Martin, was the first to admit that he'd been instructed to insert unapproved frames into reels. These weren't your typical editing flubs. They were meticulously placed symbols, a brief image of a playing card, a fleeting shot of a neon street sign, or a quick pan over a particular building facade. To the untrained eye, they meant nothing. To certain people in Chicago or Las Vegas, they were coded orders. Martin claimed that these instructions always came from someone above the studio, often delivered through vague memos or last-minute phone calls. Payment for the extra work wasn't on the books. It arrived in envelopes, cash only, slid across the table at quiet diners. At first, he rationalized it as harmless, but when one of the symbols he inserted coincided with the murder of a known mob rival just days later, he realized he was an unwilling accessory. In 1960, Martin contacted an FBI field agent he knew socially. The meetings were held in the back of a small photo lab in Burbank. There, Martin handed over spliced film segments, explaining their hidden meanings and which mob factions were involved. His evidence was compelling enough to spark a quiet but aggressive investigation into the practice. But whistleblowing in this world came with a deadly expiration date. Weeks after his second meeting with the FBI, Martin vanished. His apartment showed no signs of struggle, his car was found neatly parked outside a movie theater, and his bank accounts were untouched. The only clue? A single movie ticket stub for a film whose trailer he had edited just a month earlier. Martin's disappearance didn't make front-page news. In fact, it barely made the papers at all. A single, vague blurb buried deep in the back pages of the Los Angeles Herald under missing persons. But behind closed doors, the FBI treated it as a potential mob hit disguised as a walkaway. The Bureau had been trying for years to crack the code between Hollywood's glittering image and organized crime's shadowy influence. Martin's insider knowledge was their best lead, and now he was gone. Agents retraced his steps in the days before he vanished. Records showed he clocked out from the editing bay at Warner Brothers on a Friday evening. From there, he was seen grabbing a late dinner at Musso and Frank, alone, flipping through a stack of movie stills. A waitress later remembered him looking nervous, like he kept checking the door. The following morning, a neighbor claimed to see him leaving his apartment carrying a single film canister. That was the last confirmed sighting. The ticket stub left in his car was for the Beverly Hills Picture Palace, a theater with rumored mob ties and a history of creative accounting at the box office. The film on the marquee? A harmless romantic drama. But the trailer before it, edited by Martin, was the real focus. FBI analysts suspected it contained a final coded message, possibly one that sealed his fate. When agents tried to subpoena the trailer, they hit a wall. The print had been accidentally destroyed in the projection booth just days after Martin went missing. Witnesses claimed a new guy in a tailored suit, and Fedora oversaw the disposal. No one knew his name, and no one wanted to ask. By late 1960, the case stalled. With no body, no crime scene, and no willing witnesses, Martin became another ghost story whispered in Hollywood's editing rooms. Some said he'd been relocated under a new identity. Others believed he was buried somewhere in the desert, alongside too many other mob secrets. By the late 1950s, the whispers about coded messages in movie trailers had grown too loud for the industry to ignore. Studio bosses, terrified of losing public trust, and perhaps even more afraid of drawing federal attention, began a quiet but calculated campaign to clean house. This wasn't a public purge with flashing headlines. It was a silent backroom operation designed to remove the problem without admitting it ever existed. Editors who had worked on certain questionable trailers were abruptly reassigned or encouraged to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Projectionists, known for their mob-friendly ties, were replaced with fresh faces vetted by private investigators. But the real push came from the government. The FBI had taken a keen interest, not because of Hollywood's morals, but because coded messages were seen as a direct threat to national security. Imagine the Cold War paranoia of the era, the thought that mobsters could hide instructions in the very films Americans watched, made for the kind of nightmare scenario intelligence agencies loved to stamp out. Agents began paying unannounced visits to editing rooms, inspecting film reels, and even screening random trailers in the name of quality control. It was intimidation with a polite smile. To keep up appearances, studios doubled down on wholesome public images. Trailers leaned into family-friendly comedies, musicals, and safe historical dramas. anything to distract from the dark cloud hanging over Tinseltown. Yet, behind the glamour, it was clear that this cleanup wasn't about morality. It was about control. The old mob ties were not severed. They were simply buried deeper, hidden behind layers of corporate respectability and more sophisticated ways of doing business. The players might have changed, but the game? That was still very much alive. And as the mob's visible presence in Hollywood seemed to fade, the next phase of their strategy emerged, one that would leave the public completely unaware of just how close they still were to the silver screen. By 1960, the mob had seemingly melted away from Hollywood's front lines. The loud parties, the bold premieres, the whispered sightings of wise guys at studio gates, all of it faded like a scene cut from a film. Publicly, it looked like the mob had been driven out by the combined force of federal pressure and studio self-policing. But behind the curtain, the reality was far more calculated. Rather than risk further scrutiny, mob bosses realized they didn't need to be physically present to maintain influence. Instead, they shifted to a quieter, more profitable approach, investing in studios and distribution companies through clean, legitimate-looking business fronts. Real estate in Los Angeles became a favorite tool. By owning the buildings that housed editing rooms, film labs, and even small production outfits, they ensured that Hollywood still owed them, quite literally, the ground it stood on. Some insiders claimed that respectable businessmen who suddenly appeared in Beverly Hills were nothing more than mob proxies, placed there to launder profits and control decision-making from the shadows. The messages in the trailers may have disappeared, but the money behind those trailers often still carried the same fingerprints. The brilliance of this quiet exit was that it gave everyone an out. The studios could say they'd cleaned up, the feds could declare a win, and the mob, they could keep making money while avoiding the spotlight entirely. It was the kind of ending that, ironically, Hollywood itself might have scripted, one where the villain walks off unpunished, blending into the crowd as the credits roll. But as the new decade dawned, there were still whispers. A cryptic scene here, a suspicious cameo there. Enough for those who knew the old ways to wonder if maybe, just maybe, the mob's hidden messages never really disappeared at all. Today, the idea of the mob hiding coded messages in movie trailers sounds like the plot of a wild crime thriller. But for those who lived through the 1950s, it was an open secret whispered in editing rooms and studio hallways. It's impossible to prove how widespread the practice was, and maybe that's exactly how the mob wanted it. The less evidence, the more it stayed in the realm of rumor and plausible deniability. Still, the effects lingered long after the supposed golden era of mob influence ended. Studios became hyper-aware of who was funding their projects, and federal investigators kept a closer watch on entertainment industry financing. Hollywood's image, glossy on the outside but shadowy underneath, was cemented in the public imagination. The idea that art could be used as a covert tool for power wasn't just a conspiracy theory anymore. It had precedent. Even decades later, film historians and conspiracy sleuths continue to debate whether some of the odd creative choices in mid-century cinema were accidents or intentional signals. Strange editing cuts, lingering shots on seemingly random objects, even peculiar color choices in film posters, all are examined under the lens of hidden influence. The mob may have stopped sending their messages through trailers, but they'd already accomplished something more lasting. They proved that Hollywood could be bent to their will without ever leaving fingerprints. It was a reminder that in an industry built on illusions, the most dangerous manipulations are the ones the audience never notices. And maybe that's why the story refuses to die. Like a faint watermark on a film reel, the traces are still there, invisible to most, but undeniable to those who know where to look. The lights may have gone down on the mob's Hollywood game, but for anyone paying attention, the reel never truly ended.